At my brother's wedding, I stood hidden behind the heavy oak door of the bridal suite and heard my own mother negotiating my financial ruin. "Just force her to transfer the deed to the Oak Bluffs beach house to Trenton," she whispered sharply. "She is a single woman anyway. She does not need a $950,000 legacy property." The very next morning, I sold that beach house. And while I was at it, I sold the Buckhead mansion my parents were living in too. They never saw it coming. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family. My name is Valerie, and I am 32 years old. The day my family crossed the line began under the crystal chandeliers of the most exclusive country club in Atlanta. My brother Trenton was marrying Harper, a woman whose family money stretched back generations. The reception hall was a suffocating display of performative wealth. Thousands of white orchids dripped from the ceiling. For my parents, Calvin and Yvonne, this wedding was their ultimate crowning achievement. It was their entry ticket into high society and their chance to prove their version of Black excellence to Harper's wealthy white relatives. I stood near the ice sculpture wearing a custom emerald silk bridesmaid dress that I had paid for myself. As usual, I was placed on the periphery. My parents were busy hovering around Trenton, treating him like a visiting dignitary. Trenton was always their golden boy. Every mistake he made was smoothed over. Every failed business venture was quietly bailed out. Meanwhile, I was expected to be quiet, accommodating, and invisible. I was sipping sparkling water when Harper approached me. She wore a custom designer gown that cost more than most people's annual salary. In her hand, she held a glass of dark red wine. She smiled at me, but her eyes were cold and calculating. She had never liked me because I never played into her savior complex. "Oh, Valerie," she said, her voice overly loud, drawing the attention of her bridesmaids standing nearby. "I am so glad I caught you before the formal portraits." Before I could respond, Harper took a sudden, exaggerated step forward. Her hand tilted, and the entire glass of red wine splashed directly down the front of my emerald silk dress. The dark liquid soaked through the expensive fabric, instantly leaving a massive, glaring stain right on my chest. I froze, gripping my glass. I knew it was not an accident. There was no stumble, no genuine trip. It was a deliberate, calculated movement. "Oh my goodness!" Harper gasped, pressing her empty hand to her mouth in a display of mock horror. "I am so terribly sorry, Valerie. I just completely lost my footing in these heels." Several guests turned to look. Harper's bridesmaids exchanged knowing smirks. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to remain completely steady. "You spilled red wine on me, Harper, right before the family portraits." Harper sighed, waving her hand dismissively, as if my ruined dress was a minor inconvenience. "Well, you should probably go wash that right now," she instructed, her tone taking on a sharp, condescending edge. "We absolutely cannot have you ruining the aesthetic of the family photos. The photographer has a specific vision, and that stain is an eyesore. Just stand on the absolute edge of the group if you cannot get it out. Or better yet, maybe you should just sit the pictures out entirely." I stared at her, letting the sheer audacity of her words hang in the air. I was a private equity founder who managed millions of dollars daily. I negotiated with ruthless corporate titans for a living. Yet here was my new sister-in-law treating me like a clumsy servant. Before I could tell Harper exactly where she could shove her aesthetic, my parents rushed over. They had seen the entire exchange. I looked at my father, expecting him to call out Harper's blatant disrespect. Instead, Calvin grabbed my arm tightly, pulling me a step back. "Just go clean it up, Valerie," he hissed, his voice low and furious. "Do not cause a scene and embarrass us in front of Harper's family. They are watching us." I looked from my father to my mother. Yvonne was busy smoothing down Harper's veil, offering apologies to the bride as if I was the one who had thrown a glass of wine. "I am so sorry about her clumsiness." "Harper," my mother cooed, adjusting the tulle fabric. She turned a glaring look toward me. "Go to the bridal suite and scrub that out immediately, Valerie. You are always finding ways to pull attention away from your brother. Stop being selfish and handle it quietly." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. My parents were so desperate to cater to Harper's wealthy family that they would happily throw their own daughter under the bus. They saw Trenton marrying into white wealth as their ultimate victory, and I was merely collateral damage required to keep the peace. I looked at Trenton, who was standing a few feet away. He saw the wine. He saw our parents scolding me. He simply took a sip of his bourbon, turned his back, and walked away to join Harper's father at the cigar bar. I did not argue. I did not cry. Arguing would imply that I valued their opinions, and crying would give Harper the victory she wanted. I simply nodded, smoothed my ruined silk skirt, and walked away with my head held high. Let them have their perfect pictures. I knew my worth, and I did not need to be in their performative portraits to prove it. I walked down the long carpeted corridor toward the bridal suite. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I reached out to push it open to find some club soda and towels, but I stopped dead in my tracks. Voices were coming from inside the room, my parents' voices along with Trenton's. They had slipped away from the reception hall, using a different hallway, and they were arguing fiercely. My hand hovered over the brass door handle as I held my breath. The conversation I was about to overhear would end my relationship with my family. It would ignite a chain reaction that would strip them of everything they valued most. They thought I was just the quiet, accommodating daughter who would take their disrespect indefinitely. They had no idea who they were really dealing with or the massive secret power I held over their very lives. I pressed my back against the cool, textured wallpaper of the corridor. The voices bleeding through the crack in the heavy oak door were unmistakable. Trenton was pacing. I could hear the sharp scuff of his expensive leather dress shoes against the hardwood floor. He was breathing heavily, sounding completely panicked, a stark contrast to the smug groom who had just watched his wife humiliate me moments ago. "I cannot do this." Dad, Trenton practically choked out the words. "I am drowning. Harper wants to look at summer homes in the Hamptons next month. Her father expects me to match their investment in the new startup. They think I am pulling in 7 figures. If they look too closely at my accounts, the whole facade is going to collapse. I have maxed out the credit lines you co-signed, and the business loan is in default." My father let out a heavy, frustrated sigh. "Calm down, Trenton. You are acting like a fool on your wedding day. We told you to secure this marriage first. Harper's family has generational wealth. Once you are fully integrated into their trust structure, these temporary cash flow issues will not matter. You just need a bridge to keep up appearances until her father hands over the reins to his holding company." "A bridge?" Trenton laughed bitterly. "Dad, I need $1 million just to clear the immediate debt and pretend I can afford the lifestyle I promised her. Where am I going to get $1 million by next week?" The bank already laughed me out of the office. That is when my mother's voice sliced through the tension, smooth and chillingly practical. "Your sister has $1 million sitting right on the water in Martha's Vineyard." My heart slammed against my ribs, but I forced myself to remain perfectly still. Oak Bluffs. They were talking about my sanctuary. 2 years ago, I purchased a historic property in Oak Bluffs, an area deeply rooted in Black elite history. I bought it as a retreat from the grueling hours I spent building my private equity firm. It was the first major reward I had ever bought for myself, and I paid for it entirely in cash. My parents had scoffed at the purchase back then, calling it a frivolous waste of money for a woman with no husband and no children to entertain. "You mean?" Valerie Trenton sounded hesitant but immediately intrigued. "She is never going to just hand over the keys to Oak Bluff's mom. She loves that house. She practically lives there all summer. Plus, she has been acting so arrogant lately, ever since she started her little consulting firm or whatever it is she does." My mother scoffed a sound of pure disdain that made my blood run cold. "Please," Yvonne said sharply. "Valerie does not understand the first thing about building a true family legacy. She is a 32-year-old single woman playing business. What does she need a $950,000 property for? To host her single friends. It is a waste of resources. You are the man of this family, Trenton. You are building a new family line today with Harper. You need a legacy property to show her parents that we come from the same kind of pedigree they do. We need to secure this generational wealth for your new family. I closed my eyes, fighting the urge to barge into the room. A little consulting firm. That is what they called the private equity firm I built from the ground up. A firm that managed assets they could not even fathom. They deliberately chose to belittle my success because acknowledging my true power would mean admitting their golden boy was an absolute failure. It was the same dynamic we had growing up. When I worked 2 jobs to pay my own college tuition, they barely noticed. But when Trenton dropped out of business school, they bought him a brand new luxury car to ease his stress. Yvonne is right, Calvin murmured, his voice taking on that authoritative tone he usually reserved for his church congregation. Valerie has a duty to this family. We did not raise her to be selfish. We raised her to understand that the family unit comes first. If she holds on to that house while her brother loses his marriage, and our family name is dragged through the mud by Harper's Country Club friends, it would be a sin. A direct violation of everything we stand for. But how do we get her to actually sign the deed over? Trenton asked, his voice laced with greedy anticipation. She is stubborn. You saw how she looked at us when Harper spilled the wine. She is not just going to gift me $1 million asset because we ask nicely. We are not going to ask nicely, Calvin replied, his tone hardening. We are having a family dinner tomorrow night at our house in Buckhead. I have already invited Pastor Jenkins to join us. We will sit her down and lay out the reality of the situation. We will remind her of the sacrifices we made to put her through school. We will use the scripture. We will make it clear that holding back this property is an act of supreme selfishness against her own flesh and blood. Surrounded by the family and the pastor, she will not have the spine to say no. She never causes a scene. She will cry, a little complain, and then she will sign the transfer papers to keep the peace. She always folds when we press her. She has to, Yvonne added firmly. We will tell her it is a wedding gift. A long-term loan if that makes her feel better, though. We all know you will never need to pay it back once you are in with Harper's father. It is settled. Tomorrow night, Oak Bluffs becomes yours, Trenton. Now fix your tie and wipe that sweat off your face. Your bride is waiting for her perfect husband. I listened to the rustle of clothing and the clinking of ice and glasses as they celebrated their brilliant strategy. They had it all figured out. They were going to use my faith, my loyalty, and my desperate desire for their love as weapons to strip me of my hard-earned assets. They honestly believed I was just a quiet, accommodating girl who would hand over a nearly $1 million home to fund the illusions of a brother who could not even afford his own wedding reception. For a brief second, a wave of profound sorrow washed over me. These were my parents. The people who were supposed to protect me were actively plotting my financial ruin in a bridal suite while I stood in the hallway covered in red wine. They viewed my life, my achievements, and my property as nothing more than a community pot for Trenton to dip into whenever he failed. But the sorrow lasted only a second. It was immediately swallowed by a cold, absolute clarity. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was for victims, and I was nobody else's victim. I stepped away from the heavy oak door, moving silently down the carpeted hallway until I reached a quiet alcove near the grand staircase. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. I bypassed the family group chats and the wedding planner's messages, scrolling straight to my favorites list. I tapped the contact labeled Marcus Legal. Marcus was the lead attorney for my firm and a man who specialized in swift, aggressive asset liquidation. I quickly typed out a message, my thumbs flying across the screen with lethal precision. Marcus, I need a massive favor. Get the Oak Bluffs property deed prepared for an immediate transfer. Contact Silas Thorne's acquisitions team. I know Thorne has been trying to buy my beach house for 2 years. Tell his team I am ready to sell right now today. But the deal must close within 24 hours, and it must be a quiet cash transaction. Do not ask questions. Just get the paperwork ready. We are selling tomorrow morning. I hit send and watched the message turn blue. Silas Thorne was a notoriously ruthless tech billionaire who valued ultimate privacy. He had offered me above market value for the Oak Bluffs house multiple times, because it bordered his own massive estate, and he hated having neighbors. He hated trespassers even more. Selling to him was not just a financial decision. It was a strategic masterstroke designed to protect my assets and punish anyone foolish enough to try and steal them. I slipped the phone back into my clutch and looked down at the dark wine stain ruining my silk dress. My family thought they were going to ambush me at dinner tomorrow night. They thought they were going to corner me with guilt and religion and force me to hand over the keys to my sanctuary. They had no idea that by the time we sat down for their little intervention, the house would already belong to a billionaire with a highly trained armed security detail. I smoothed my hair, took a deep breath, and walked back toward the reception hall, a dangerous smile forming on my lips. The ballroom was a sea of crystal and roses. I navigated through the crowd of laughing guests, my ruined dress acting as a physical reminder of my place in this family. Trenton was holding court near the center of the room. He had a glass of bourbon in one hand, and his new bride wrapped around his other arm. Harper was beaming, showing off her ring to a group of her aunts. They looked like the perfect picture of success. I knew differently now. I stood near a towering floral arrangement, watching my brother play the role of the successful entrepreneur. He laughed loudly, clapping Harper's father on the back, telling some exaggerated story about his latest acquisitions. The sheer audacity of his performance was almost impressive. He was standing in a rented tuxedo surrounded by flowers he could not afford, pretending to be a titan of industry while actively plotting to steal his sister's home. I took a sip of my sparkling water. I felt a clinical detachment. I was a spectator watching a house of cards prepare to collapse. The reception carried on with extravagant excess. The open bar had been flowing freely for hours, pouring top-shelf liquors and champagne, as if money were an infinite resource. Trenton had insisted on the premium package, boasting that his guests deserved nothing but the absolute best. He had loudly proclaimed that the drinks were entirely on him, a grand gesture to welcome Harper's family. Now the time for grand gestures was coming to an end. I watched as the venue manager, a tall man with a severe expression, approached the main bar. He spoke quietly to the head bartender, who then printed a long receipt. The manager placed the receipt inside a black leather folder and began walking purposefully toward Trenton. Trenton was in the middle of a boastful story about a fictional real estate deal when the manager interrupted him. The manager leaned in close, offering a polite but firm smile. He opened the black folder and presented the bill. I was close enough to see the total printed at the bottom of the itemized charges: $15,000. Trenton did not even blink. He maintained his arrogant grin, pulling a platinum card from his jacket pocket. He dropped it onto the folder with a loud clack. "Take care of it," my brother instructed, waving his hand. "Keep the change." The manager nodded smoothly and walked back to process the payment. Less than 2 minutes later, he returned. His polite smile had vanished, replaced by a tight look of professional concern. He leaned in close to Trenton again, holding out the platinum card. "I am sorry, sir, but this card has been declined," he murmured. His voice was low, but the words carried perfectly to the small group gathered around the groom. Harper's uncle stopped mid-sentence. Harper turned her head, her perfectly painted lips parting in confusion. Trenton let out a forced laugh, snatching the card back. "Fraud alert," he announced to the group, shaking his head in mock annoyance. "You know how these banks are. You spend a little too much and they freeze everything to protect you. Give me a second." He pulled out his wallet and retrieved a black credit card, sliding it over. "Try that one. It is the corporate account." The manager walked away. Trenton resumed his story, but I could see a bead of sweat forming at his temple. His shoulders were rigid. When the manager returned for the third time, the tension became palpable. "Declined again, sir," the manager stated. Trenton swallowed hard. He dug into his wallet, pulling out a third card. "Try this one." I watched the bartender run the card. The machine beeped a sharp negative sound. The manager walked back, holding the third rejected card. I am afraid we have another decline, sir. The venue requires payment before the event concludes. If you cannot provide a valid form of payment, I will have to contact security. The whispers began immediately. Harper's parents exchanged a look of horror. Harper looked like she was about to burst into tears of humiliation. Trenton was visibly shaking, patting his pockets, as if a magical pile of cash might suddenly appear. My mother, Yvonne, had been mingling near the dessert table when she noticed the commotion. She hurried over, her eyes darting between the venue manager, the rejected cards, and Trenton's sweating face. She assessed the situation and absolute panic set in. Her golden boy was being exposed as a fraud in front of the very people she was trying to impress. Yvonne spun around, scanning the crowd, until her eyes locked onto me. She marched over, grabbing my upper arm with a grip so tight her manicured nails dug painfully into my skin. "Valerie," she hissed, pulling me toward the bar. "Give Trenton your card right now." I looked down at her hand on my arm, then up at her desperate face. "Excuse me," I said softly. "Do not play dumb with me," Yvonne whispered fiercely. "Harper's family is watching. You need to pay this tab. It is only $15,000. You can afford it. Save your brother's face. Do your duty to this family after everything we have sacrificed for you. Pay the man before they call the police." I looked over at Trenton. He was staring at me pleadingly, expecting me to save him, just like our parents always did. He expected me to fund his lies. I gently but firmly peeled my mother's fingers off my arm. I smoothed the fabric of my ruined dress, the dress they had watched Harper destroy without a single word of defense. I looked at the venue manager, who was waiting impatiently with the leather folder. Then I looked directly at my mother and my brother, making sure my voice carried clearly to Harper's parents, standing just a few feet away. "I am sorry," I said, my tone calm and perfectly clear. "My money only covers people who respect me." I turned my back on their collective shock. I grabbed my evening clutch from a nearby table and walked out of the ballroom. Behind me, I could hear Harper's mother gasp and the venue manager instructing his staff to call security. The heavy doors shut behind me, muting the chaos I had left inside. The cool night air felt incredibly refreshing. I handed my ticket to the valet and waited. As the driver pulled my vehicle around the driveway, my phone buzzed in my hand. The screen illuminated with a message from my father. The text was blunt and furious. "Family meeting tomorrow at 6 in the evening. Bring the Oak Bluffs property documents. It is time you paid back what you owe this family." I locked my phone, slipped into the leather seat, and told the driver to take me home. From the 42nd floor of the Apex Holdings building, I could see the Atlanta skyline. My family believed I was a mid-level financial consultant. They had never bothered to visit my office. If they had, they would have realized I was the founder and majority shareholder. I sat behind my marble desk, staring at the flashing screen of my phone. They were panicking about the disaster I had left behind at the country club, demanding I show up tonight with the deed to my beach house. I swiped the phone to silent quickly. My lead attorney, Marcus, sat across from me, holding a thick leather folder. He had been with my firm since the beginning and knew exactly how toxic my family dynamics were. "I told you to get the paperwork ready last night," I said, keeping my voice low. "Is everything prepared?" Marcus nodded, sliding a stack of legal documents across the desk. "The purchase agreement for the Oak Bluffs property is fully drafted," he confirmed. I contacted Silas Thorne's acquisition team as instructed. "Thorne has been trying to acquire your lot for 2 years. He is wiring the $950,000 directly into your private accounts as we speak." Silas Thorne was a notoriously ruthless tech billionaire who treated his privacy like a religion. By selling my house to him, I was placing a massive, impenetrable wall between my property and my entitled family. If Trenton and Harper thought they could stroll into Oak Bluffs for a weekend getaway, they were about to face a harsh reality. I signed my name, sealing the transfer. "Valerie," he began, "are you absolutely certain you want to do this? Selling the beach house is one thing, but the other document you asked me to prepare is going to cause an explosion you cannot undo. Once I file this, there is no going back." I set the pen down and met his gaze. My family thinks they are ambushing me tonight, Marcus. They think they can use guilt to force me to surrender my sanctuary to a brother who cannot afford his own wedding reception. They do not know the truth. Marcus let out a very heavy breath. The truth is going to destroy them. The truth is, they destroyed themselves 4 years ago. I countered, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You know exactly what happened, Marcus. 4 years ago, my parents were secretly facing complete financial ruin. Trenton had convinced them to leverage their retirement savings and take out a second mortgage on their Buckhead mansion to fund his luxury logistics company. When the business went under, he walked away without a scratch and left our parents holding a massive bag of debt. They were going to be thrown out onto the street. And you saved them, Marcus added quietly. I bought the house from the bank through a blind trust, I said, the bitter memory burning in my chest. I instructed the property management company to lease the mansion back to them. For 4 entire years, my parents have been living in that massive house, completely unaware that their disappointing daughter actually owns the roof over their heads. I subsidized their lavish lifestyle while they continued to treat me like a second-class citizen. I let them maintain their country club facade because despite everything, they were still my parents. But they crossed the line last night, Marcus asked. They crossed it a long time ago, I said. But yesterday they proved that my loyalty means absolutely nothing to them. They expected me to pay off Trenton's bar tab to save face, and now they are plotting to steal the only property I ever bought just for myself. They want to strip me of my assets to fund Trenton's fake reality. But the worst part, Marcus, the absolute worst part, is the rent. My parents have not paid their discounted rent in 3 months, I stated, my voice cold and flat. They stopped paying the property management company so they could divert all their cash toward Trenton's extravagant wedding. They prioritized white orchids and premium open bars over their own basic housing expenses. They assumed the anonymous corporate landlord would just grant them an extension because they asked nicely. They defaulted on their lease to pay for a wedding that Trenton could not afford. Exactly, I replied. And under the terms of the lease agreement that they signed, 3 months of non-payment triggers an immediate default and eviction process. Marcus opened the second half of the leather folder. He pulled out a single stark document printed on heavy yellow paper. It was a formal notice of eviction. He slid it smoothly across the marble desk toward me. The local authorities have already reviewed the lease violations, he explained. Since the tenant is severely delinquent, the magistrate granted the expedited order this morning. You just need to sign off as the head of the holding company. Once you sign, the sheriff's department will execute the warrant. I picked up the pen again. My mother had texted me earlier this morning bragging that she was hosting a lavish high tea party this afternoon. She had invited all the most affluent women from her church congregation to the Buckhead house to celebrate Trenton's beautiful wedding and to boast about the new beach house they were securing for him. I stared at the yellow paper. I thought about the sheer arrogance of a woman hosting a high society tea party in a house she no longer owned, using money she had stolen from her rent budget to celebrate a son who was actively trying to rob his own sister. I am signing this, I said, my hand hovering over the paper. But I have one specific condition for the delivery. Name it, Marcus said, crossing his arms and waiting for my answer. I want the eviction notice served today, I instructed. Do not send a warning email. Do not let the property manager call them. I want the county sheriff's deputies to walk right up to the front door of that Buckhead mansion. I want them to serve this notice while my mother is pouring tea for the pastor's wife and the entire church committee. Let her affluent friends see exactly what kind of generational wealth my family actually possesses. Marcus nodded, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. The deputies are on standby, Valerie. They can be at the property by 3 this afternoon. I signed my name with a sharp, decisive flourish and handed the yellow document back to him. Just do it, I said. Serve the eviction. The wrought iron gates of the Buckhead estate swung open. I looked at the sprawling brick mansion with its manicured lawns and towering oak trees. My parents had lived here for 15 years, projecting an image of untouchable success. Walking up the stone steps, I felt a profound sense of irony. This was my property. I paid the property taxes. I paid for the luxury landscaping my mother constantly bragged about. Yet here I was being summoned to a meeting like a disobedient child. The housekeeper let me in and I walked toward the formal living room. The heavy doors were open. Inside, the scene was staged with theatrical precision. Calvin sat in his leather wingback chair, looking stern. Yvonne sat on the velvet sofa, her posture rigid, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Trenton lounged near the fireplace, sipping expensive scotch, looking completely unbothered by the absolute humiliation he had faced the night before. Sitting directly across from the entrance, nursing a cup of tea, was Pastor Jenkins. Seeing the pastor confirmed how far my parents were willing to go. Pastor Jenkins was the spiritual leader of the most prominent megachurch in the city. Bringing him here was a calculated move to corner me. They knew I respected the church, and they intended to weaponize my faith to extract the deed to my beach house. I took a seat opposite my parents. No one offered me a drink. No one asked how my day was or if I had recovered from the wedding drama. Calvin cleared his throat, adopting the booming voice he usually reserved for his congregation. Valerie, he began, leaning forward. We called you here because we need to have a serious discussion about family, about unity, about what it means to protect our own in a world trying to tear us down. You deeply understand the importance of the Black family unit? Valerie. Calvin continued, his gaze heavy with manufactured disappointment. For generations, our people have only survived because we pooled our resources together. We lifted each other up. When one of us succeeds, we all succeed. When one of us stumbles, the rest of us form a wall to catch them. We sacrificed everything to give you the education and the opportunities you have today. Now it is your turn to reinforce the foundation of this family. Yvonne nodded solemnly, adjusting her silk shawl. Your brother is entering a crucial phase of his life, Valerie. He is building a brand new family. Harper's parents come from a long, continuous line of generational wealth. They expect Trenton to provide a certain standard of living to show that he comes from an equal pedigree. You are a single woman. You have no husband and no children to provide for. What do you truly need a $950,000 property in Oak Bluffs for? It is sitting empty while your brother needs a legacy asset to secure his new marriage. I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of polite attention, while my mind processed the sheer magnitude of their delusion. They were sitting in a house they did not own, unaware that their eviction notice was already in motion, demanding that I surrender my beach house to fund the lies of a man who could not even afford the liquor at his own wedding. Trenton swirled the ice in his glass, looking at me with an entitled smirk. He actually believed he deserved my hard-earned assets, because he was born male and had tricked a wealthy woman. Pastor Jenkins set his teacup down with a soft clink. The sound echoed in the tense silence. Valerie, my child, he said, his voice dripping with condescending warmth. The good book tells us to whom much is given, much will be required. You have been blessed with immense financial abundance. Wealth hoarded for selfish purposes becomes a spiritual burden. Proverbs teaches us that a brother is born for a time of adversity. Trenton is facing a difficult transition that requires the family to stand united. Giving him this property is a spiritual investment in the legacy of your bloodline. It is an act of profound grace. The hypocrisy of the situation was staggering. Pastor Jenkins was quoting scripture about selflessness while helping my parents extort their own daughter. Did they quote scripture to Trenton when he blew through hundreds of thousands of dollars on luxury cars while his business collapsed? Did they preach about family unity when they watched Harper pour red wine down my dress? No. The rules of sacrifice and holy duty only ever applied to me. I was always expected to be the silent, accommodating workhorse, carrying the weight of their ambitions, while Trenton reaped all the unearned glory. My father leaned forward, his expression hardening significantly when I did not immediately agree. Do not be stubborn about this, Valerie. We are simply asking you to transfer an unused physical asset to secure your brother's future. Once Trenton is fully established with Harper's family trusts, he will ensure you are taken care of. This is merely a temporary bridge to permanent family wealth. You owe it to the family name to make this one sacrifice. You should be proud to help your brother Yvonne, added her voice, taking on a sharp, demanding edge. You should want to see him succeed and thrive. Holding on to that house out of pure selfishness is a terrible look. What will the church congregation think when they hear you refuse to help your own brother establish his new family? Do you really want to carry the heavy shame of being the one who let the family fall apart just so you can have a vacation home? Trenton finally spoke up, his tone dripping with unearned confidence. Look, Val, I know you like the house. It is a cute little spot, but you have to look at the bigger picture here. Harper's father needs to see that I have substantial hard assets in my name before he opens up his massive investment portfolio to me. Oak Bluffs is the perfect high society location to prove we belong in their exclusive circle. You are just managing a small consulting business. You do not need to play the real estate mogul. I am the one swimming with the actual sharks now. I need the right financial armor. I stared at the three of them, and then at the pastor, who nodded in solemn agreement with Trenton's absurd statement. They had spent the last hour systematically invalidating my existence, my career, and my total worth as a human being. They had invoked God, holy duty, and heavy guilt to justify their bottomless greed. They truly thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They expected me to lower my head, apologize for my perceived selfishness, and quietly hand over the deed to my personal sanctuary. I did not break eye contact with Trenton. I kept my posture completely relaxed, my hands resting easily in my lap. I let the heavy silence stretch out, forcing them to sit in the highly uncomfortable tension they had so carefully created. Finally, I smiled tightly. So my $950,000 house is the only way Trenton can survive. Trenton took a slow, arrogant sip of his scotch, leaning back against the stone mantel with a smug grin. It is about legacy, Val. You would not understand. Before I could even formulate a response to Trenton's ridiculous claim about legacy, the heavy mahogany doors of the formal living room swung open wider. Harper strolled in. She was wearing a pristine white tennis skirt and a cashmere sweater draped effortlessly over her shoulders, looking exactly like she had just stepped out of an elite country club catalog. She walked with an unearned sense of ownership through the house that my company secretly owned. She gracefully took a seat right next to Trenton, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his knee and casting a dismissive glance in my direction. She immediately chimed in, inserting herself into a financial discussion about a property she had zero legal or moral claim to. Trenton is entirely right, Valerie, she said, her voice dripping with that sickly sweet condescension she always reserved specifically for me. Maintaining a historic property of that magnitude is incredibly demanding. It is not just about the mortgage payments. There are massive property taxes, seasonal upkeep, and highly specialized insurance requirements. With your little finance job, you must be stretching yourself so incredibly thin just to keep the lights on and the lawn mowed. It is honestly a blessing that we are stepping in to take this massive financial burden off your shoulders. I stared at her, letting her profound ignorance hang heavily in the tense air of the living room. My little finance job was a private equity firm that moved more capital in a single week than her father managed in an entire fiscal year. But she was not finished. She leaned forward, her eyes shining with a manic, greedy excitement as she detailed her grand plans for my personal sanctuary. Besides, the place is incredibly dated and gloomy. Harper continued, waving her hand through the air as if swatting away a fly. Oak Bluffs is a cute little area, but the house itself needs a complete and total overhaul. I have already contacted my lead interior designer in Manhattan. We are going to rip out all that dark, heavy wood and completely smash those old-fashioned stained glass windows. We are painting the entire exterior a crisp, modern white and knocking down that depressing historical wraparound porch to put in a sleek infinity pool with a swim-up bar. It is going to look completely chic and minimal. I am erasing all that dusty history and giving the property a fresh, clean, luxury aesthetic. My stomach turned over completely. Oak Bluffs was not just some cute beach town. It was a historic, prestigious haven for the Black elite. The dark, heavy wood and the intricate stained glass she wanted to violently destroy were original features carefully crafted by free black artisans over a century ago. She wanted to strip away generations of rich cultural heritage and replace it with a sterile, lifeless trend that would look like every other generic mansion in her social circle. My parents sat there nodding their heads in eager, enthusiastic agreement, utterly willing to let this woman pave over our rich history just so they could claim a superficial association with her family trust fund. Trenton grinned broadly, kissing Harper's cheek with exaggerated affection. See, Val Harper has the vision to truly elevate the property. You should be thanking us for stepping in and maximizing its potential before it falls apart. The sheer audacity was truly breathtaking. They were openly discussing gutting my home and erasing its history while I was sitting right across from them in a house I was currently allowing them to live in. A younger version of me would have stood up and screamed until my throat was raw. I would have slammed my corporate bank statements onto the coffee table and humiliated Trenton right in front of his oblivious, arrogant bride. I would have exposed my parents' bankruptcy to the pastor. But I was no longer that reactive girl. I was a woman who had already sold the beach house to a notoriously dangerous billionaire and arranged for my parents' immediate eviction. I just needed them to feel completely victorious today, so the catastrophic fall tomorrow would be absolute and final. I consciously let my shoulders slump forward perfectly, mimicking the posture of a thoroughly defeated woman. I looked down at my lap, taking a deep, shaky breath, as if I were desperately fighting back a flood of tears. "You are right," I whispered, forcing my voice to sound small, broken, and entirely submissive. "I cannot keep fighting the family. I am so tired of arguing. If this is what Trenton truly needs to secure his marriage and build his legacy, then I will not stand in the way anymore. The property is yours." The reaction in the room was immediate and deeply nauseating. My mother let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, pressing both her hands to her chest. "Oh, praise the Lord," she exclaimed, looking upward toward the ceiling. "I knew you would finally see reason, Valerie. I knew you would not let petty selfishness destroy your brother's foundation." Pastor Jenkins clapped his hands together, beaming with righteous satisfaction as he leaned forward in his chair. "This is the ultimate power of faith and family unity," he boomed, his voice filling the room. "You have done a beautiful, selfless thing today, Valerie. The Lord will surely reward your obedience to your parents and your unwavering devotion to your brother." Calvin nodded firmly, a look of supreme triumph settling onto his face as he adjusted his suit jacket. "I will have the family lawyer draw up the official transfer deed by tomorrow afternoon," he declared. "We will get this handled smoothly and quietly." I kept my head bowed, hiding the sharp, dangerous smile that threatened to break across my face. "I just need one small thing," I said, keeping my tone quiet and accommodating. "I have personal items at the house. Family heirlooms, clothes, some expensive artwork. I need 48 hours to clear out my personal belongings before you take full possession. Just give me 2 days to empty the house completely." Trenton waved his hand magnanimously, looking like a king granting a pardon to a peasant. "Take the whole weekend, Val. Clear out whatever junk you need. We are flying up on Monday morning to start the demolition process anyway." I stood up, thanked the pastor for his spiritual guidance, and walked out of the living room, leaving them to their premature celebration. I had exactly what I needed. They were completely blinded by their own unchecked greed. By the time I reached the back seat of my waiting car, my phone buzzed loudly with an Instagram notification. Harper could not even wait a single hour to brag to the world. I opened the application and watched her latest video story. She was holding a crystal glass of champagne, smiling brightly for her 100,000 followers. "Hubby and I just secured a massive historic beach mansion in Martha's Vineyard." She squealed into the camera, her eyes wide with excitement. "We are hosting a huge exclusive housewarming party this weekend to celebrate before the major renovations begin. Cannot wait to see all my VIPs there." I sat in the quiet luxury of my car and played the video one more time. They were planning to trespass and throw a massive party on a property legally owned by Silas Thorne. I smiled softly, tapped the screen, and forwarded Harper's video directly to Silas Thorne's head of private security. 24 hours passed with excruciating slowness. I sat in the private suite of my wealth management firm, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the bustling Atlanta streets below. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished hardwood floor of my office, but my mind was completely focused on the island of Martha's Vineyard. Harper and Trenton were likely packing their designer luggage right now, filling their leather bags with premium resort wear for a house they firmly believed they had successfully stolen from me. They had absolutely no idea that they were walking straight into a meticulously crafted and highly dangerous trap. Silas Thorne was not a man who tolerated trespassing under any circumstances. He was a notoriously private tech billionaire who employed former military personnel to guard his extensive real estate portfolio. By forwarding Harper's boastful social media post directly to his security team, I had guaranteed that my brother and his arrogant bride were going to face a devastating reality check the second they stepped foot on that exclusive property. My lead attorney Marcus walked into the room carrying a sleek silver laptop and a stack of final closing documents. He took the leather seat across from my desk, his expression incredibly serious, but holding a faint trace of quiet anticipation. He opened the laptop and connected it to the secure banking portal. "The bank manager is on the line securely," Marcus said, keeping his voice low and steady. "Silas Thorne's financial team has initiated the transfer sequence. We are just waiting for the International Clearinghouse to process the transaction and release the funds." I nodded, keeping my eyes glued to the glowing screen Marcus had turned toward me. This was the moment of absolute finality. I was permanently giving up a home I had deeply loved, a beautiful sanctuary I had purchased with my own hard-earned money to escape their constant judgment. But I was willingly trading those historic walls for something infinitely more valuable. I was buying my permanent freedom from my family and their endless financial abuse and emotional manipulation. We sat in total silence for what felt like an eternity. The only sound in the vast office was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on my wall. I thought about the sheer audacity of Harper's words the day before. She had called my life entirely insignificant while planning to destroy a piece of profound cultural history. She wanted to erase the legacy of Black artisans just to install a generic infinity pool. I felt a deep sense of peace knowing she would never get the chance to swing a single hammer. Then the screen refreshed. A bright green notification banner appeared at the very top of the banking portal. The balance in my blind trust account updated instantly. $950,000 had successfully cleared. The funds were fully verified and securely locked into my private holding account. Marcus let out a long breath and formally closed the laptop. "The transaction is fully complete, Valerie," he stated. "Silas Thorne is officially the legal and sole owner of the Oak Bluffs estate. The deed has been recorded with the county clerk's office. You are entirely free and clear of the property." I leaned back in my chair, feeling a massive heavy weight lift off my chest. Just as Marcus spoke, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently on the marble desk. It buzzed once, twice, then continuously, as a rapid flood of text messages poured in. I picked up the device and looked at the bright screen. My mother Yvonne was aggressively demanding my immediate attention. Her messages were filled with the exact same suffocating entitlement she had displayed in the formal living room the day before. "Valerie, you need to overnight the house keys to Trenton right now," she wrote. "Harper has caterers arriving at the vineyard early tomorrow morning to set up the champagne tower for the housewarming party. Do not ruin this momentous occasion for your brother by being slow and irresponsible. Send the tracking number the moment you drop the package at the shipping facility." Another message popped up immediately after. This one was from Trenton. "Do not drag your feet on this, Val. Harper's father is flying in on his private jet for the party. I need full access to the security system, the gate codes, and the instructions for heating the pool today. Send them over right now before you go to your little job." I stared at their demanding and highly disrespectful words, reading the absolute arrogance in every single syllable. They really believed I was scrambling to obey their harsh orders. They truly thought they had completely broken my spirit and forced me into total submissive compliance. I felt a cold and incredibly calm satisfaction wash over my entire body as I tapped the glass screen to open the digital keyboard. I did not type out a long, angry paragraph defending my worth. I did not explain that Silas Thorne was currently deploying a heavily armed private security detail to surround the entire perimeter of the coastal estate. I did not tell them that the local police department in Oak Bluffs was likely already on high alert for trespassers matching their exact descriptions. I simply gave them exactly what they asked for with a polite and terrifyingly compliant tone. I typed my response carefully and deliberately. The spare keys are hidden under the mat by the front door, I wrote. I left the main security gate unlocked for you. Have a wonderful weekend. The house is all yours. I hit send and watched the small green bubble deliver the message. I knew with absolute certainty that the moment they arrived at that property, they would not find a welcoming luxury vacation home. They would find stern security guards, a highly hostile billionaire owner, and the absolute destruction of their carefully crafted social image. Harper's wealthy parents would watch their new son-in-law get publicly detained for trespassing on private property. Trenton's desperate and pathetic attempt to fake generational wealth was going to end in public humiliation right in front of the exact people he was trying so hard to impress. I placed the phone face down on the desk and looked back up at Marcus. He was watching me with a look of deep professional respect. He knew exactly what I had just set into motion. But Oak Bluffs was only the first phase of my retaliation. The beach house was just the shiny distraction I needed to keep them completely blind to the real disaster heading straight for their front door in Atlanta. The heavy glass door to my office swung open and my executive assistant Chloe walked in. She was holding a thick manila folder stamped with a bright red official county seal. She walked briskly across the spacious room and handed the folder directly to me. I opened it and looked at the stark yellow paper inside. Chloe looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and professional awe. I just received the call from the county dispatch office, she said, her voice completely steady. The magistrate judge signed the final order this morning. The local sheriff has fully approved the expedited eviction for the Buckhead mansion. I looked down at the official warrant bearing my parents' full names and the address of the home they falsely claimed to own. The timing was absolutely perfect. My mother was currently hosting her lavish high tea party, completely unaware that her entire world was about to collapse. I pictured her standing in that grand foyer wearing her best silk dress, pouring expensive imported tea for the pastor's wife and the entire church committee. She was likely boasting about Trenton's new island estate right at this very moment, basking in the stolen glory of a life she did not earn. Are the deputies on their way? I asked, keeping my tone flat and entirely professional. Chloe nodded, stepping back toward the heavy glass door. They are heading there right now, Valerie, she confirmed. They have the official paperwork in hand, and they are pulling into the neighborhood. They will be knocking on the front door in less than 20 minutes. Across town in the affluent neighborhood of Buckhead, my mother was completely in her element. The formal dining room and adjoining sunroom of the mansion had been transformed into a lavish high society tea party. The long mahogany table groaned under the weight of 3-tiered silver trays, displaying delicate cucumber sandwiches, miniature fruit tarts, and imported scones. A harpist played softly in the corner, setting an atmosphere of refined elegance. Around the room sat 20 of the most influential women from my parents' megachurch, including Pastor Jenkins' wife. They were all dressed in pastel silk dresses and wide-brimmed hats, sipping Earl Grey from antique porcelain cups. My mother was holding court, floating between the clusters of wealthy women, with a radiant smile plastered across her face. She was exactly where she loved to be, the absolute center of attention, basking in the glow of manufactured envy. I could easily picture the scene because I had watched her play this exact role 100 times before. She was standing near the grand staircase, speaking loudly enough for everyone in the foyer to hear her carefully rehearsed bragging. Yes, Trenton is doing wonderfully. she boasted, her voice echoing lightly off the crystal chandelier. He and Harper are just so busy building their future. In fact, we just finalized a massive real estate acquisition for him. He is taking possession of a historic $950,000 estate in Oak Bluffs, up in Martha's Vineyard. They are flying out there on Monday to begin the luxury renovations. The church committee women cooed and gasped in admiration, offering their enthusiastic congratulations. They complimented my mother's exceptional parenting, praising the family for securing such incredible generational wealth. My mother soaked up every single syllable of their flattery, pretending that her son's completely unearned lifestyle was a direct result of her brilliant guidance. She smoothed the skirt of her floral dress, completely oblivious to the flashing blue lights pulling past the wrought iron gates and into the circular brick driveway. The heavy brass knocker on the front door slammed 3 times, shaking the frosted glass panes. The sudden aggressive noise cut right through the delicate harp music. The polite chatter in the room instantly died down. The housekeeper Maria hurried across the marble foyer, wiping her hands on her apron to answer the door. Before she could even turn the brass handle, the heavy door was pushed open from the outside. 2 massive, heavily armed county sheriff's deputies stepped right into the grand entryway. Their heavy black tactical boots squeaked loudly against the pristine marble floor. Their utility belts jingled and police radios squawked with static, completely shattering the refined, high society atmosphere. The church ladies froze mid-sip, their teacups hovering awkwardly in the air. The harpist abruptly stopped playing, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence hanging over the sunroom. My mother marched forward, her face flushed with immediate indignation. She drew herself up to her full height, adopting the haughty, commanding tone she used to intimidate retail workers and bank tellers. "Excuse me," she snapped, glaring at the 2 officers. "What is the meaning of this intrusion? You cannot just barge into my private home during a private event. I demand to know who let you onto this estate." The lead deputy, a tall man with a thick gray mustache, did not look even slightly intimidated. He held a clipboard in his left hand and a bright yellow piece of heavy cardstock in his right. He glanced down at the paperwork and then looked directly at my mother. "Are you Yvonne or Calvin?" he asked, his voice booming through the quiet foyer. "I am Yvonne," my mother replied, crossing her arms defensively. "This is my home, and you need to leave immediately before I call the chief of police. I know him personally." The deputy ignored her threat completely. "Ma'am, we are here executing a court-ordered warrant signed by the county magistrate this morning," he announced loudly, making absolutely sure his voice carried into the dining room, where the entire church committee was eagerly listening. "We are serving a formal notice of immediate eviction. The property management company representing Apex Holdings LLC has filed for default due to severe financial delinquency. Your account is exactly 90 days past due on rent. You have 72 hours to completely vacate these premises, or we will return to physically remove you and your belongings from the property." A collective loud gasp erupted from the sunroom. Pastor Jenkins' wife dropped her silver spoon onto her saucer with a sharp clattering sound. Whispers instantly broke out among the affluent women. They were hearing the undeniable truth. The prominent, wealthy family they had been admiring and praising just seconds ago was actually a month behind on rent and getting thrown out onto the street by the police. My mother's face transitioned rapidly from flushed red to an absolute ghostly pale. The pristine facade she had spent 15 years carefully maintaining was disintegrating right in front of her most important social circle. She lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger at the deputy. "This is an outrageous mistake," she screamed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched panic. "We do not rent this house. We own it. My husband and I bought this estate 15 years ago. We are the sole owners. You have the wrong address. You need to get out of my foyer right now." The deputy remained completely deadpan, immune to her frantic outburst. He reached into his clipboard and pulled out the certified public property record. He thrust the document directly into her chest, forcing her to take it. "Check the county records yourself, ma'am," he stated plainly. "You have not owned this property in 4 years. The deed clearly belongs to Apex Holdings LLC. You signed a standard lease agreement to rent the property from them. You violated the terms of that lease by failing to pay your rent for 3 consecutive months. The court has granted the landlord full possession." With a swift, practiced motion, the second deputy stepped forward holding a roll of heavy-duty tape. He slapped the bright yellow notice of eviction right onto the center of the custom mahogany front door, pressing it down firmly. The words "Final Notice" were printed in massive, bold black letters impossible to miss. 72 hours, the lead deputy repeated. Have a good day, ma'am. The two officers turned and walked out, leaving the front door wide open. The cold reality of the situation rushed into the foyer. My mother stood there hyperventilating, clutching the property record in her shaking hands. She looked over her shoulder at the dining room. The wealthy church ladies were quickly and quietly gathering their designer purses, avoiding eye contact with her as they rushed to exit through the side doors. The ultimate humiliation was complete. She had been exposed as a complete fraud. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely turn the pages of the legal documents the deputy had handed her. She flipped frantically to the second page of the lease agreement, searching for a lifeline. Her eyes landed on the emergency contact number for the property management division of Apex Holdings. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket and dialed the number with frantic, desperate jabs of her fingers, intending to scream at whatever low-level manager answered the phone. Back in my office on the 42nd floor, I sat quietly at my desk. The room was perfectly still. My private cell phone, resting face up on the cool marble surface, suddenly lit up and began to ring. The heavy ringing echoing in my quiet office was not coming from my personal cell phone, but from the dedicated corporate landline sitting on the corner of my marble desk. This was the highly restricted, unlisted number for the property management division of Apex Holdings. I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. I reached over and booted up the voice masking software on my computer terminal. I had installed the expensive application years ago to handle blind trust business without exposing my identity to aggressive contractors. I routed the incoming call through the audio filter, selecting a crisp, highly professional, and completely unrecognizable male voice. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the absolute power of the moment, before pressing the blinking green button to connect the call. Apex Holdings Property Management, I said, my filtered voice filling the room with a deep, authoritative timbre. How may I direct your call? A loud, ragged sob came through the speaker. It was a sound of total devastation that I had never once heard my mother make. Hello, she gasped, her breath catching in her throat. My name is Yvonne. My husband and I lease the property on West Wesley Road in Buckhead. We just had 2 sheriff deputies barge into our home and put a terrifying eviction notice on our front door. There has to be a terrible mistake. We are good, upstanding people. I pulled up the dummy file on my screen, pretending to review her account. There is no mistake, ma'am, I replied coldly. The system shows your account is exactly 90 days delinquent. The eviction order was legally granted by a magistrate judge this morning. You have completely defaulted on your lease agreement. You do not understand, Yvonne cried, her voice rising in sheer panic. We had a massive family emergency situation. Our son Trenton just got married this weekend. It was an incredibly expensive high society wedding, and we had to front a huge amount of cash to cover the vendors and the luxury venue. We just needed a temporary grace period. We have been perfect tenants for 4 entire years. Please, you have to call the sheriff and stop this. We are hosting a high tea party right now. The most important women in our church congregation are watching the police walk through my foyer. It is an absolute nightmare. I sat back in my leather chair, staring out at the Atlanta skyline. My mother was literally crying over the phone to a corporate stranger, begging for mercy because she had chosen to fund Trenton's vanity project instead of paying for the roof over her own head. She was prioritizing her social image, even while her entire life was collapsing. For years, she had looked down on my career and my choices. Just yesterday, she had sat in that very house and demanded I surrender my only sanctuary to support her golden child. Now she was weeping like a helpless child over the consequences of her own actions. A luxury wedding is not a legally recognized financial emergency, Mom, I said, injecting the digital voice with maximum corporate indifference. Your personal expenditures do not invalidate your contractual obligations to Apex Holdings. Furthermore, our latest property inspection report indicates multiple severe violations of your residential lease. Violations! Yvonne stammered, her crying pausing in sheer confusion. What violations? We treat this beautiful house perfectly. We maintain the landscaping to the highest possible standards. You have permitted unauthorized occupants to reside on the premises, I stated flatly. The lease strictly prohibits long-term guests without prior written corporate approval. The individual identified as Trenton has been utilizing the property as his primary residence and business address for months. You have also hosted multiple large-scale unauthorized events that violate the neighborhood noise and traffic ordinances. You treat the property like you own it, Mom. You do not. But he is our son, Yvonne pleaded, sounding completely broken. He needed a place to stay while he launched his logistics company. You cannot hold that against us. We are a family who supports each other. I clenched my jaw, feeling a hot wave of anger burn through my chest. A family who supports each other. They supported Trenton by stealing from their rent budget, while simultaneously trying to extort my beach house to cover his remaining debts. They did not know the meaning of the word family. They only understood blind devotion to a son who had bled them completely dry. Apex Holdings is not a charity organization, I replied, my altered voice echoing coldly through the spacious office. You deliberately withheld 90 days of rent to throw a party for an unauthorized tenant. The eviction stands. You have exactly 72 hours to remove all personal property from the premises. If you fail to comply, all remaining items will be dragged to the curb by county officials. Do not call this number again. I disconnected the line before she could utter another pathetic sob. The silence returned to my office, thick and deeply satisfying. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool marble desk. For 15 years, my mother had looked down her nose at everyone who did not meet her impossible financial standards. She had called my career a cute little job and treated my home like a disposable asset. Now she was the one begging a faceless landlord for a few more days in a house she could no longer afford. I watched the digital clock on my computer screen tick forward. I knew exactly what was happening at the Buckhead estate right now. The church ladies were fleeing the premises, spreading the delicious gossip of the eviction to every wealthy socialite in Atlanta. My mother was likely collapsed on the velvet sofa, weeping hysterically, while Calvin tried to formulate a desperate plan to save their precious public image. The absolute shame of being exposed in front of the pastor's wife would be eating her alive. Her entire identity was wrapped up in projecting wealth and superiority. Now the entire congregation would know that they were deadbeats who could not even manage their basic living expenses. They had 72 hours to find a massive amount of cash or face complete public ruin, and I knew exactly who they were going to call to save them. They were going to demand that I sacrifice myself to fix the disaster they had created. They still thought I was completely ignorant of their living situation. They still believed they could manipulate me into liquidating my own assets under the guise of family duty. Less than 5 minutes after I ended the call with my mother, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently across the desk. The caller ID flashed brightly, showing my father's name. Calvin never called me during business hours unless he wanted to issue a command or criticize a decision I had made. I let it ring 3 times, letting his anxiety build to a boiling point before I slowly picked up the device and answered without saying a word. Valerie, we have a massive catastrophic crisis. Calvin bellowed into the phone, completely abandoning his usual composed pastoral tone. He was breathing heavily, his voice thick with sheer unadulterated panic. We need you to contact your real estate broker and sell the Oak Bluffs house today. I do not care what kind of loss you take on the asking price. We need the liquid cash wired to our accounts immediately so we do not lose the Buckhead house to the bank. I held the phone to my ear, listening to my father's frantic, ragged breathing. Calvin, the man who had always spoken to me with measured condescension, was practically hyperventilating. He demanded that I liquidate my hard-earned assets immediately to save them from a public eviction. I did not give him the satisfaction of an argument over the phone. I kept my voice perfectly flat, entirely devoid of the panic he was desperately trying to provoke. I told him I would be there in 30 minutes to discuss the situation in person, and I hung up before he could issue another frantic command. The drive to the Buckhead estate was profoundly peaceful. The afternoon sun bathed the Atlanta skyline in a warm golden hue, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt completely detached from my family and their self-inflicted chaos. They had spent decades using my stability as their personal safety net, recklessly burning through money while treating me like a second-class citizen. Now they were facing the brutal consequences of their own financial deception, and I was simply going to be a spectator. When I pulled into the circular brick driveway of the mansion, the scene was already a picture of absolute disaster. The front door was propped wide open, and the bright yellow notice of eviction remained slapped firmly against the mahogany wood, an undeniable beacon of their total failure. I stepped out of my car and walked up the pristine stone steps, the silence of the affluent neighborhood contrasting sharply with the frantic shouting echoing from inside the house. I crossed the threshold into the grand foyer and stopped. The remnants of my mother's high society tea party were still scattered across the dining room table. Half-eaten scones and spilled tea stained the expensive lace tablecloth. But the real chaos was happening in the formal living room. My mother Yvonne was on her hands and knees in her ruined silk floral dress, sobbing hysterically as she frantically wrapped her expensive crystal vases in crumpled newspaper and shoved them into cardboard boxes. My father Calvin was pacing the hardwood floor, his face bright red and glistening with sweat, barking orders at the housekeeper who was rushing up and down the grand staircase with armfuls of designer clothing. Standing in the center of this absolute destruction, completely unhelpful and radiating sheer irritation, were Trenton and his new bride Harper. They were not packing. They were not comforting my weeping mother. Instead, Harper was clutching her expensive leather handbag, her face contorted in a furious scowl, screaming at her new husband. She was aggressively complaining that my parents' sudden lack of funds might somehow impact their upcoming luxury honeymoon to the Maldives. Trenton was running his hands through his perfectly styled hair, looking utterly enraged that his parents' financial collapse was inconveniencing his post-wedding bliss. He looked up and saw me standing quietly in the archway of the living room. His eyes narrowed, and his posture immediately shifted into his familiar stance of arrogant authority. He stomped across the room toward me, his face twisted in a demanding sneer. "It is about time you got here, Valerie," he snapped, his voice echoing loudly over my mother's frantic sobbing. "We are in the middle of an absolute catastrophe, and you are dragging your feet. Mom and Dad have exactly 72 hours to pay the property management company, or they are going to be thrown out onto the street like common criminals. We cannot let that happen. It would completely destroy our family reputation." I looked at him with absolute calm. "And what exactly do you expect me to do about their unpaid rent, Trenton?" I asked, my tone perfectly level. He glared at me as if I were incredibly dense. "What do you think you need to do, Valerie?" he barked, waving his hands wildly in the air. "You need to call your bank right now. You are going to take out an emergency equity loan against that beach house in Oak Bluffs. You need to pull out at least $100,000 in cash and wire it directly to Dad's account by tomorrow morning. If you cannot get the loan approved fast enough, then you are going to call your real estate broker and list the property for a cash buyer today. Mom and Dad need that money immediately." My mother stopped wrapping her crystal and looked up at me from the floor, her face streaked with heavy black mascara. "Please, Valerie," she whimpered, her haughty demeanor completely shattered. "You have to save us. We spent everything we had on Trenton's wedding. We have absolutely nothing left in the bank. You cannot let us lose this house." Harper stepped forward, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Yes, Valerie," she chimed in, her tone dripping with toxic entitlement. "You really need to step up and do your part for the family. Trenton and I cannot touch our honeymoon fund to fix this mess. That money is strictly reserved for our international travel. You have a massive historic property just sitting there doing nothing. Be useful for once and liquidate it so your parents do not end up homeless." I looked at the four of them, my mother begging on the floor, my father sweating in a panic, my brother aggressively demanding my assets, and his arrogant wife protecting her luxury vacation while ordering me to sacrifice my entire life savings. They truly believed I existed solely to be their financial shield. They fully expected me to blindly hand over my beloved sanctuary to fix a disaster they had deliberately created. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the absolute finality of the moment. I looked directly into Trenton's furious eyes and delivered the reality check that would permanently shatter their delusions. "I cannot take out a loan, Trenton," I said, my voice ringing with crystal clear authority. "And I cannot sell the house to save them." Trenton's face turned a deep shade of crimson. "Do not give me your selfish excuses, Valerie," he yelled, taking an aggressive step forward. "You have the deed. You have the equity. You are going to do exactly what I tell you to do." I held my ground, refusing to back down a single inch. "I am not making excuses," I replied, stating the facts with cold precision. "I cannot leverage the property or sell it because I do not own it anymore. The house was sold this morning. The funds have already been permanently locked into a blind trust that none of you will ever be able to access. I do not own the Oak Bluffs estate. I have absolutely nothing to give you." A suffocating dead silence fell over the chaotic living room. My mother dropped a crystal vase, and it shattered into 100 pieces on the hardwood floor, but nobody even flinched. Calvin stopped pacing, completely frozen in his tracks. Trenton stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as his brain completely failed to process the magnitude of what I had just said. The golden goose was gone. Their ultimate safety net had been completely vaporized. Before my parents could even process the sheer horror of their impending homelessness, Harper broke the silence with an ear-piercing shriek. She threw her hands in the air, stamping her designer heels against the floor in a massive childish tantrum. "Are you out of your mind?" she screamed at me, her face twisted in pure rage. "You sold the Vineyard House. I literally promised my entire bridal party that we were spending the weekend at that estate. I have a champagne brunch scheduled. I have private caterers arriving tomorrow morning. My father is flying his private jet up there to celebrate. You cannot just sell the house and ruin my entire social weekend." Trenton snapped out of his shock, his entitlement rapidly overriding all basic logic and reason. He grabbed Harper's hand, his eyes wild with desperate arrogance. "Do not panic, Harper," he said, his voice shaking with delusional confidence. "We are still going to Martha's Vineyard. She texted me earlier that the keys are hidden under the front mat, and the main security gate is unlocked. The buyer probably has not even moved in yet. We are going to fly up there and take the property by force. The family paid for her success, so that deed is basically ours anyway. We will just occupy the house for the weekend and deal with the legalities later." He glared at me with absolute contempt, refusing to accept defeat. "You are completely useless to this family, Valerie," he spat. "We are leaving." Trenton tightly gripped Harper's hand, and they stormed past me, marching furiously out the front door to catch their flight. They were marching straight into Silas Thorne's private security trap, completely blinded by their own towering arrogance. I sat in the quiet sanctuary of my vehicle parked a few blocks away from the Buckhead estate. The chaotic shouting from my parents' ruined lives was far behind me now. I pulled my phone from my purse and opened a social media application. Harper was notoriously addicted to public validation. I knew with absolute certainty that she would broadcast her entire illegal vacation to her thousands of followers. I typed her username into the search bar and found her profile instantly. A blinking red ring around her profile picture indicated that she was currently broadcasting a live video. I tapped the screen and watched my meticulously laid trap snap perfectly into place. The video feed opened to a sweeping view of the historic Oak Bluffs coastline. The sky was a brilliant shade of blue, and the ocean breeze whipped through Harper's perfectly styled blonde hair. The camera panned around to reveal Trenton standing proudly next to a rented luxury SUV. Behind them stood 4 of their elite wealthy friends. There were 2 men in pastel polo shirts and expensive loafers, and 2 women wearing oversized designer sunglasses and carrying oversized canvas beach totes. They were laughing loudly and passing around a silver flask, completely oblivious to the massive felony they were about to commit. "Look at our new summer home, you guys," Harper squealed to the camera, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Trenton just bought this amazing historic property on Martha's Vineyard. We are going to do a massive gut renovation to make it actually livable, but the location is totally to die for. Trenton puffed out his chest and threw an arm around Harper's shoulders, playing the role of the generous billionaire husband. He confidently led the group of trespassers up the long, winding gravel driveway. I watched through the small screen as they approached the grand wraparound porch of the estate. My heart remained perfectly calm. I felt absolutely no attachment to the building anymore. It belonged to Silas Thorne now, and Silas Thorne was a man who aggressively protected his investments. Trenton marched straight up to the front door, acting like the absolute king of the castle. He dramatically bent down and lifted the heavy woven welcome mat. He produced the spare brass key, holding it up for Harper's camera to capture. "See, babe, I told you it was waiting right here for us," he boasted. He slid the key into the heavy lock and turned it. The heavy oak door swung inward with a smooth, silent glide. The group cheered loudly and pushed their way into the grand foyer. Harper kept the camera raised high, giving her audience a full tour of the destruction they were causing. It had rained earlier that morning on the island, and the ground outside was soft and muddy. None of them bothered to wipe their expensive shoes. I watched as 6 pairs of muddy soles stomped directly over the priceless antique Persian rug that adorned the entryway. They tracked thick, dark mud across the pristine hardwood floors, leaving a trail of absolute disrespect in their wake. One of the male friends pulled a heavy green bottle of expensive champagne from his tote bag. He peeled off the gold foil and violently popped the cork. The pressurized cork ricocheted off the historic crown molding, leaving a visible dent in the antique woodwork. The champagne foamed over the top of the bottle, spilling down his hands and splashing directly onto the vintage silk wallpaper. The group shrieked with laughter, thinking the property damage was incredibly hilarious. Harper turned the camera around to face herself, holding her phone high to capture the spacious, formal living room behind her. "Oh my gosh, you guys, look at this tacky decor!" she whined, wrinkling her nose in dramatic disgust. The previous owner clearly had absolutely zero taste. "Look at these dark, gloomy paintings and all this heavy, depressing furniture. It is giving total haunted house vibes. We are going to rip all of this out by Monday. I am thinking bright white walls, minimal furniture, and a massive infinity pool right out back." The other 2 women stepped into the frame, holding their muddy shoes and laughing obnoxiously. They began picking up small decorative items from the mantel and mocking them loudly to the camera. They were holding pieces of rich cultural history artifacts, crafted by local Black artisans decades ago, and treating them like cheap garbage. They were completely violating a space that I had spent years lovingly restoring, but I felt absolutely no anger. I only felt a deep sense of profound anticipation. They were building their own prison cell with every single word they broadcast to the internet. Trenton grabbed the champagne bottle and took a long, careless swig before passing it to Harper. "Let the party officially begin," he shouted, throwing his arms wide open. "We own this island now." But his triumphant shout was suddenly interrupted by a very distinct and terrifying noise. The microphone on Harper's phone picked up the heavy, aggressive crunch of thick tires moving rapidly across the gravel driveway outside. It was not just one vehicle. It was a synchronized convoy moving with intense military precision. The laughter in the living room abruptly died down. Harper lowered her phone slightly, the camera tilting toward the large bay windows at the front of the house. "What is that noise?" one of the female friends asked, her voice suddenly losing its arrogant edge. "Did you guys invite the caterers early?" Trenton frowned and walked confidently toward the front window, peering through the sheer white curtains. He clearly expected to see a delivery van or a neighbor coming to welcome the new wealthy owners. Instead, the live stream captured his entire body, freezing in total shock. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very small. Harper moved up behind him, lifting the camera so her followers could see exactly what was happening outside. Through the pristine glass windows, the video feed showed 4 massive matte black SUVs surrounding the property. They had pulled up in a highly tactical formation, completely blocking the rental vehicle and cutting off any possible exit route from the driveway. The engines of the heavy vehicles idled with a deep, menacing rumble. The trap had officially closed. The doors of the four matte black SUVs swung open in perfect synchronized unison. A dozen heavily armed men stepped out onto the crushed driveway, gravel their expressions obscured by dark sunglasses and the harsh mid-morning light. Half of them wore the dark tactical uniforms of Silas Thorne's elite private security detail, their utility belts loaded with heavy equipment. The other half were fully uniformed officers from the Oak Bluffs Police Department. They moved with absolute ruthless efficiency, spreading out to quickly secure every possible exit around the sprawling coastal estate. Inside the grand foyer, the obnoxious booming laughter of Trenton and his wealthy friends instantly died in their throats. Harper stood completely frozen, holding her expensive smartphone high in the air, the live broadcast still actively capturing every single second of the unfolding disaster. The digital chat scrolling rapidly across her screen had already exploded with thousands of confused and panicked comments. Heavy tactical boots pounded up the wooden steps of the wraparound porch, shaking the historic floorboards. Before Trenton could even move toward the entryway, the heavy oak door was shoved entirely open. A burly police sergeant strode into the foyer with his hand resting firmly on his radio, flanked by two massive private security guards. The officer's thick boots crunched loudly against the shattered glass of a champagne flute that had just been dropped by one of Harper's terrified friends. Oak Bluffs Police, the sergeant barked, his voice booming off the intricate crown molding. Nobody move a single inch. Drop the bottles and put your hands in the air where I can see them right now. Trenton immediately puffed out his chest, his arrogant entitlement completely blinding him to the severe danger of the situation. He simply could not fathom a world where his assumed wealth did not automatically grant him absolute immunity. He took a bold, aggressive step forward, pointing an accusing finger at the armed officers. "What the hell do you think you are doing barging in here like this?" he demanded, his voice dripping with rich condescension. "I am Trenton, and this is my wife Harper. Our family owns this entire estate. My sister Valerie just finalized the paperwork and gave us the keys this morning. You are trespassing on private property, and my father-in-law will personally see to it that you are all fired by the end of the day." The police sergeant did not even blink at the empty, pathetic threat. He reached into his tactical vest and produced a folded legal document, snapping it open with a sharp flick of his wrist. "You are incredibly mistaken, son," the sergeant replied, his tone completely devoid of any amusement. "I am holding the certified property deed recorded just hours ago. This estate is legally owned by Silas Thorne. Mr. Thorne does not tolerate unauthorized visitors under any circumstances, and his private security team reported a massive breach on the premises 10 minutes ago." The name Silas Thorne hung heavily in the tense air. Even Harper's completely oblivious trust fund friends knew exactly who the notoriously ruthless tech billionaire was. Harper's face drained of all color, her perfectly manicured hand trembling violently as she continued to inadvertently broadcast her own demise to over 15,000 live viewers. The digital chat scrolling across her glowing screen shifted from confusion to absolute brutal mockery. Her wealthy social circle, her parents' country club friends, and her entire bridal party were watching the horrific spectacle unfold in real time. Comments were flying past, reading that they were common criminals and asking why her father was not fixing this. "We did not break in!" Harper shrieked, her voice pitching into a high, hysterical whine. "The security gate was left wide open for us. The keys were right under the mat, exactly where Valerie said they would be. She told us we could come here. This is a massive misunderstanding." The sergeant looked slowly down at the thick, muddy footprints completely ruining the antique Persian rug and the sticky, expensive champagne dripping down the vintage silk wallpaper. "Finding a key hidden under a mat does not grant you legal ownership of a billionaire's private estate," he stated coldly. "You have forced entry into a highly secure historic property, caused visible malicious damage to expensive fixtures, and are currently actively trespassing. You are all under arrest for felony breaking and entering." Absolute panic erupted in the elegant living room. The two wealthy male friends immediately threw their hands in the air, begging for mercy and claiming they had nothing to do with it, while the women began to sob uncontrollably, mascara running down their faces. Trenton, however, completely lost his temper. He lunged forward, trying to snatch the legal deed out of the sergeant's hand, screaming that it was a fake document manufactured by his jealous sister. The response from the security team was immediate and violently absolute. Two tactical guards seized Trenton by the shoulders, twisting his arms roughly behind his back with practiced military precision. Harper shrieked and dropped her phone, attempting to claw at the officers to protect her husband. The smartphone landed face up on the hardwood floor, the camera lens perfectly angled toward the open front door, capturing the entire humiliating takedown in high definition. The officers dragged a kicking and cursing Trenton out the front door and down the porch steps. They shoved him roughly against the hot metal hood of a marked police cruiser. The sharp metallic click of heavy handcuffs echoed clearly through the live audio feed. Harper was dragged out right behind him, sobbing hysterically, as a female officer forced her hands behind her back and secured the steel cuffs around her delicate wrists. She wailed for her wealthy father, screaming that she was a VIP and demanding to call her expensive lawyers. But the police simply shoved her into the back of a squad car, slamming the heavy door shut and cutting off her entitled demands. The live broadcast captured every single humiliating moment, permanently cementing their absolute disgrace on the internet for the entire world to see. 1,000 miles away, in the sweltering heat of Atlanta, the situation was equally disastrous. The grand living room of the Buckhead mansion was an absolute war zone of half-packed cardboard boxes and scattered luxury items. My mother Yvonne sat slumped on a bare mattress in the middle of the floor, her hands trembling violently as she held her expensive tablet. She had tuned into Harper's livestream, hoping to catch a glimpse of the luxurious island lifestyle she was desperately trying to claim as her own. Instead, she had just watched her golden boy, her perfect successful son, get physically slammed against a police car and arrested for a major felony on national television. The tablet slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a loud, sharp crack. The glowing screen spiderwebbed into a dozen jagged pieces, but the live audio of police sirens continued to blare relentlessly from the broken speakers. She stared at the shattered glass, her mind completely unable to process the total destruction of her carefully constructed reality. The social standing she valued above human life, the wealthy connections she had sold her soul to maintain the perfect son she had financially bled me dry to support. It was all gone. It had all been completely incinerated in a matter of minutes. Calvin stood in the doorway of the bedroom, his face completely ashen, clutching a stack of useless bank statements in his sweating hands. They had absolutely no money left anywhere. They had no properties to leverage. They had no wealthy in-laws coming to rescue them now that Trenton was a documented felon. The digital clock on the bedside table flashed the time, displaying the brutal reality of their situation. The 72-hour eviction notice slapped on their front door was no longer a distant threat. It was ticking down to its absolute final hour. The sheriff deputies would be returning to Buckhead very soon, and this time they would not just be leaving a warning. They would be dragging my parents and everything they owned out onto the street. I pulled into the circular driveway of the Buckhead estate, just as two massive white moving trucks backed up to the grand front entrance. The 72-hour eviction window had officially expired. A team of burly men in matching gray uniforms was already marching up the pristine stone steps, carrying heavy steel dollies and thick rolls of industrial packing tape. They pushed past the open mahogany doors, completely ignoring the frantic protests echoing from the grand foyer. I stepped out of my car and walked inside, taking a moment to observe the final absolute collapse of my parents' meticulously crafted illusion. The house was a scene of total hysterical chaos. The moving crew was systematically dismantling the massive crystal chandeliers and hauling away the custom velvet armchairs my mother prized above all else. My father Calvin was cornered near the grand sweeping staircase, his face a sickly shade of gray. A county sheriff stood firmly before him, handing my father a thick stack of finalized legal eviction papers. Calvin looked entirely broken. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life projecting extreme wealth and pastoral authority, and now he was being publicly exposed as an absolute fraud in front of his neighbors. My mother, Yvonne, was pacing the destroyed formal living room, clutching her shattered iPad tightly against her chest like a desperate shield. Her immaculate salon-styled hair was completely disheveled, and her expensive designer makeup was ruined by hours of hysterical crying. When she looked up and saw me standing calmly in the archway, her tear-streaked face immediately contorted with a desperate manic hope. She practically sprinted across the polished hardwood floor, grabbing my arm with trembling, panicked fingers. Her expensive acrylic nails dug sharply into my skin. "Valerie, thank God you are finally here," she gasped, her voice completely hoarse and breathless. "You have to help us right now. Trenton has been arrested. They threw him in a filthy island jail cell, and the magistrate set his bail at $50,000. The bail bondsman will not accept any of our credit cards, and your father's bank accounts are completely frozen. You need to go to your bank right now and pull from your personal savings. We have to wire that cash and get your brother out of there before the media finds out and ruins his entire professional life. You are the only one who has that kind of liquid cash available." I slowly pulled my arm out of her frantic grip, feeling absolutely zero pity for her desperate situation. I walked past her and sat down smoothly on the edge of their expensive white leather sofa, perfectly composed. Two movers were standing patiently nearby, holding rolls of plastic wrap waiting for me to move so they could haul the furniture out the front door. I looked up at my weeping mother, letting the sheer audacious absurdity of her demand hang heavily in the tense air. "You want me to empty my personal savings to bail out the man who literally just tried to steal my property?" I asked, my voice echoing with a cold, calculated finality. "He broke into a highly secured private estate on live television because he firmly believed he was entitled to a house I paid for. He is currently facing multiple serious felonies for breaking and entering and trespassing, and you want me to cheerfully write a check to set him free." Yvonne stared at me, her jaw dropping in absolute horror. The desperate, pleading hope in her eyes instantly vanished completely, replaced by a violently defensive rage. She stepped forward, her face flushing a deep, angry red. She threw her shattered iPad onto a nearby packing box and pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "He is your brother!" she screamed, the sound piercing sharply through the heavy noise of the moving crew. "How can you sit there and be so completely heartless? We are a family, Valerie. We sacrificed absolutely everything for you. We gave you a beautiful home and a perfect upbringing, and this is exactly how you repay us. You are going to just let your own flesh and blood rot in a jail cell just to prove some selfish, vindictive point." I stood up from the leather sofa, stepping aside so the movers could immediately wrap it in industrial plastic. My absolute calm finally cracked as years of suppressed, deep-seated anger surged violently to the surface. "You sacrificed absolutely nothing for me," I snapped, stepping directly into her space and forcing her to look me straight in the eye. "Let us talk about your incredible parental sacrifices, Yvonne. When I was 18 years old, I begged you and Calvin for help with my college tuition. I needed just a small loan to keep my classes. You looked me straight in the face and told me that the family budget was simply too tight and that building character through hardship was important. I worked 3 exhausting minimum wage jobs to survive. I served tables until 2 in the morning and ate cheap ramen noodles in a freezing tiny dorm room just to make ends meet. But that exact same week, you and Calvin drove down to a luxury dealership and bought Trenton a brand new Mercedes SUV, simply because he complained that his older car was embarrassing him in front of his wealthy fraternity brothers. You fully funded his extravagant lifestyle while I was drowning in suffocating student loan debt. My mother opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off immediately, refusing to let her spin another convenient, manipulative lie. "Do not even try to deny it." I continued, my voice ringing with undeniable absolute truth. "For the past decade, you have blindly financed every single one of Trenton's completely failed business ventures. You handed him hundreds of thousands of dollars to play the role of the wealthy entrepreneur, while simultaneously demanding that I handle my own finances because I was an independent, strong woman. You treated my entire existence like an afterthought while you poured every single resource you possessed into your perfect golden child. You built this disaster brick by brick. You taught him his entire life that he could take whatever he wanted without ever facing a single consequence. Well, the consequences have finally arrived. He broke the law because of his own towering arrogance, and now he has to pay the literal price. And you failed to pay your rent for months to fund his luxury wedding, and now you are losing your home. I am not opening my checkbook to save any of you. I watched the devastating reality finally sink into her eyes as the movers hoisted the heavy leather sofa and carried it right past her out the front door. The heavy front door slammed shut behind the moving crew carrying the white leather sofa, leaving a massive hollow void in the center of the formal living room. Yvonne stood perfectly still, her arms hanging limply at her sides, staring at the empty space as if her entire identity had just been carried out onto the front lawn. The sheriff deputies were actively sweeping through the dining room, tagging the remaining high-value items and instructing the moving crew on what to take next. The absolute reality of their financial ruin was playing out in real time, but my father Calvin simply could not accept his defeat. He refused to acknowledge that his decades of carefully manufactured pastoral authority meant absolutely nothing in the face of a court-ordered eviction. He turned his furious gaze away from the deputies and locked his eyes entirely on me. His face was a dark mottled purple, the veins in his neck bulging against his stiff white collar. For my entire life, Calvin had used his physical presence to silence any dissenting opinions in our household. He was a large, imposing man who demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience from his children, while he secretly mortgaged our stability to pay for his elite country club memberships and luxury leased vehicles. He stomped across the bare hardwood floor, his heavy shoes echoing sharply against the wood. He invaded my personal space, stopping mere inches away from me, and raised his right hand, jabbing a thick, trembling finger directly into my face. "You are a disgrace to this family legacy, Valerie," he bellowed, his voice carrying the booming theatrical cadence he usually reserved for his Sunday sermons. "You stand there dripping in expensive clothes and arrogant pride while your mother weeps and your brother is locked in a cage. We gave you the prestigious Wilson name. We gave you the foundation to build your little business, and you abandon us the moment we face a minor temporary setback. You have zero loyalty and zero respect. But do not think for one single second that you have won anything today. We will recover from this. We have powerful friends in this city. At least we still have this roof over our heads until the sheriff comes back with the final lockout order. We will find the money and we will keep our home." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood perfectly still, staring directly into his furious, bloodshot eyes. He honestly believed he still had time. He genuinely thought that the 72-hour window granted by the property management company gave him a magical grace period to pull another financial rabbit out of his hat. He thought he could call one of his wealthy congregation members, beg for a predatory loan, and somehow save face before the neighbors realized the true extent of his total bankruptcy. He was clinging to the very house he was standing in as his final ultimate shield against public humiliation. I slowly stepped around his pointed finger and walked calmly toward the center of the room. The movers had not yet touched the heavy glass and brushed brass coffee table sitting on the bare floor. I set my pristine leather designer bag down onto the cool glass surface. The gentle metallic clink of the hardware echoed loudly in the tense, silent space between us. Yvonne finally snapped out of her frozen trance, slowly turning her tear-stained face to watch me. Calvin crossed his massive arms over his chest, breathing heavily, his nostrils flaring with unadulterated rage as he waited for me to speak. I did not say a word. I reached down and slowly unzipped the main compartment of my bag. The smooth sound of the metal zipper felt incredibly loud against the backdrop of the movers shouting instructions in the hallway. For years, my father had sat at the head of our dining table, lecturing me on the importance of building a respectable legacy. He had constantly belittled my career in real estate acquisitions, telling me that buying and managing properties was a gritty, low-class job meant for contractors and landlords, not for a refined woman of society. He had told me I lacked the sophisticated financial mind that Trenton naturally possessed. I reached inside the silk-lined interior of my bag, and my fingers wrapped around a thick, heavy manila folder. I pulled it out and held it up, allowing the overhead light to catch the official state seals embossed on the crisp, thick parchment paper inside. Calvin narrowed his eyes, his arrogant posture faltering for just a fraction of a second as he tried to identify the official-looking documents in my hands. I placed the folder flat against the glass coffee table. I opened the heavy cover and separated the papers into two distinct piles. On the left side, I placed the original stamped LLC Incorporation documents from the state registry. On the right side, I placed the master deed to the sprawling Buckhead mansion we were currently standing inside. The deed was printed on thick, high-quality legal paper bearing the bright blue seal of the county records office. I placed my fingertips against the edge of the documents and slowly, deliberately slid them across the smooth glass surface directly toward my father. They glided across the table and came to a stop right at his feet. Calvin looked down at the papers, his brow furrowed in deep, angry confusion. He looked back up at me, his jaw tight with irritation. "What is this garbage, Valerie?" he snapped, refusing to break eye contact. "Are these your pathetic little business spreadsheets? I am not interested in your petty real estate portfolio right now. I just told you that we are in the middle of a massive crisis." "Read them, Calvin," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm register. "I strongly suggest you read the names printed at the top of those documents before you say another word about the roof over your head." My mother let out a small, terrified whimper, sensing the absolute danger radiating from my quiet tone. Calvin hesitated, his arrogant bluster suddenly evaporating into a strange, nervous tension. He slowly uncrossed his arms and leaned forward over the glass table. His large hands were trembling slightly as he picked up the master deed to the Buckhead mansion. He adjusted his expensive reading glasses and focused his eyes on the bold black text printed across the top of the official document. I watched as his eyes scanned the legal phrasing. I watched the exact second his brain processed the information. His breath hitched violently in his throat, catching in a sharp, desperate gasp. The heavy legal paper began to shake uncontrollably in his hands. He dropped the deed back onto the table as if it had physically burned his skin and snatched up the LLC Incorporation documents. He read the names listed as the primary managing directors. All the blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, hollow ghost. He slowly looked up at me, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. You are Apex Holdings." "Yes," I replied, my voice absolutely steady and completely devoid of any sympathy. "For 4 years I owned the roof over your head." I stood up slowly, deliberately, towering over my shattered parents as the absolute reality of the situation crashed down upon them. "I saved you from living on the streets when your precious golden boy completely bankrupted you. And exactly how did you repay me for that silent, anonymous grace? By scheming to steal the only sanctuary I built for myself." Calvin stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He dropped the heavy legal documents back onto the glass coffee table, his massive hands shaking so violently he could barely control them. He took a stumbling step backward, his heavy leather shoes scraping loudly against the bare hardwood floor. "It cannot be true," he stammered, his booming pastoral voice reduced to a pathetic, weak rasp. "You are lying to me, Valerie. You do not have the kind of capital required to purchase a property in Buckhead. You manage low-income rental properties. There is absolutely no way you could afford to buy out the massive lien on this mansion." I crossed my arms over my chest, watching him desperately try to reconstruct his shattered superiority. "You really never paid any attention to my life, did you, Calvin?" I asked, shaking my head in pure disgust. "I am not a standard real estate agent. I own one of the most successful commercial property acquisition firms in the entire Southeast. While you were busy funding Trenton's completely fraudulent lifestyle and ignoring my existence, I was building an absolute empire. Do you remember 4 years ago when Trenton convinced you to leverage this entire estate to fund that completely disastrous tech startup he promised would make you millions? Do you remember the absolute terror in your eyes when the bank sent the final foreclosure notice because he lost every single penny of your money? Calvin swallowed hard, his face turning a sickly shade of pale gray. He looked nervously around the destroyed living room as if hoping the moving crew was not listening to his greatest shameful secret being exposed. You prayed for a miracle that week. I continued, my voice ringing clearly through the chaotic noise of the movers hauling boxes out the front door. You stood behind your expensive church pulpit and begged for divine intervention because you were terrified your wealthy congregation would find out their prestigious pastor was totally bankrupt. And then miraculously, an anonymous holding company called Apex Holdings swooped in and bought the debt right out from under the bank. They allowed you to stay in the mansion and charged you a fraction of the actual market rent. You bragged to your elite country club friends about your brilliant financial maneuvering. You never once suspected that the anonymous benefactor who saved you from total public ruin was the exact same daughter you constantly belittled and treated like garbage. Yvonne let out a loud, hysterical gasp, pressing her trembling hands against her tear-streaked cheeks. "You bought the house," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and sheer horror. "You owned this mansion the entire time, and you just let us treat you like a failure." "I let you expose exactly who you truly are," I corrected her sharply. "I gave you a safe place to live because despite all the horrible things you did to me, I still possessed a basic shred of human decency. I protected you from the streets." "And what did you do with that second chance? You immediately went right back to your arrogant, entitled behavior. You stopped paying the heavily discounted rent entirely for the past 8 months. You illegally diverted those funds to pay for Trenton's extravagant destination wedding because you simply had to maintain your fake wealthy image for his obnoxious socialite in-laws. You literally stole from the holding company that saved your lives just to fund another massive party for your golden child." Calvin tried to straighten his posture, desperately trying to summon his old intimidating authority. "Well, if you own the property, then you have the power to stop this eviction right now," he demanded, pointing a shaking finger toward the front door where the sheriff was standing. "You can call off these men. You can tear up those legal papers and let us stay. You cannot throw your own father out onto the street, Valerie." "You taught me that blood means nothing when money is involved," I replied, my tone completely unyielding. "You stopped paying rent. You violated the legal lease agreement. And then when I finally decided to purchase a quiet, peaceful home for myself, you and Trenton actively conspired to steal it from me. You encouraged him to break into my private island sanctuary and change the locks because you felt you were entitled to my hard-earned success. You threw me away like trash, but you fully expected to live like royalty on my dime. I am not stopping the eviction, Calvin. The legal process is finalized and you have absolutely zero power left in this dynamic." The absolute finality of my words finally broke through the heavy, thick wall of their shared delusion. Calvin stumbled backward, collapsing heavily into a wooden dining chair the movers had not yet wrapped. He buried his face in his trembling hands, his broad shoulders shaking as the reality of his total public destruction set in. He had lost his fake fortune, his prestigious home, and his golden son all in the exact same morning. But Yvonne was not ready to surrender. She looked at her defeated husband and realized he could no longer protect her lifestyle. She turned her desperate, manic eyes toward me and suddenly threw herself forward. She dropped hard onto her knees, hitting the bare hardwood floor with a loud, painful thud. She crawled forward, her expensive designer dress dragging across the dusty floorboards, and reached out with both hands trying to grab my legs. "Valerie, please!" she wailed, her voice echoing with a shrill, hysterical desperation. "You cannot do this to us. We are a family. We share the same blood. Think about what people will say. Think about our reputation in the community. We are supposed to represent Black excellence. We are supposed to show the world that we are successful and united. If you throw us out onto the street, the media will destroy us. They will laugh at us. You have to protect the family name, Valerie. You have the power to fix all of this. I am begging you on my hands and knees. Please do not turn your back on your own flesh and blood. I looked down at the woman kneeling on the floor. Her makeup was smeared in dark, ugly streaks across her cheeks, and her perfectly styled hair was a chaotic mess. She was using the exact same manipulative guilt trips she had weaponized against me my entire life, trying to hide her toxic greed behind the noble concepts of family loyalty and cultural pride. She did not care about me. She only cared about maintaining her fake wealthy facade, and she was willing to drag herself across the floor to keep it. I felt a deep, profound wave of absolute physical disgust wash over me. I stepped backward, pulling my legs completely out of her frantic reaching grasp. "Do not ever speak to me about family blood or excellence again," I said, looking down at her with cold, absolute contempt. "There is nothing excellent about theft and fraud and lies." I picked up my designer bag from the glass coffee table, leaving the deed and the eviction notices sitting right in front of them. The movers pushed past us, carrying a heavy oak cabinet heading straight for the open front door, where the bright morning sunlight was streaming inside. I turned my back on my weeping mother and my broken father, leaving them alone in the empty ruined shell of their own making. I had barely taken 5 steps toward the grand entryway when the heavy tread of tactical boots signaled the return of the county sheriff. The brief 72-hour window, allowed for the moving crew to salvage the furniture, had officially slammed shut. The lead deputy strode straight into the center of the foyer, his expression completely devoid of any sympathy or patience. He unclipped a heavy ring of brass keys from his utility belt and pointed a stern finger toward the open front door. "The time for packing is over," he announced, his voice echoing loudly off the bare walls of the dismantled house. "The property is now legally secured under the ownership of Apex Holdings. You have exactly 2 minutes to gather whatever personal items you can carry in your hands and step off the premises. Anyone remaining inside after that will be immediately arrested for criminal trespassing." Yvonne let out a piercing, completely unhinged shriek. She spun around wildly, her eyes darting across the empty living room, searching for her expensive, remaining valuables. She lunged toward a delicate antique side table, attempting to scoop up a heavy silver decorative bowl, but a second deputy immediately stepped directly into her path, blocking her way. "Personal clothing and basic necessities only," the deputy stated firmly. "Everything else stays with the property." He reached into his tactical pocket and pulled out 2 thick black industrial trash bags, snapping them open with a loud, sharp plastic crack. He handed them directly to my mother. "Fill these and get out right now." The sheer visual humiliation of the moment was absolutely staggering. Yvonne, a woman who had spent the last 2 decades treating retail workers and waitstaff like absolute dirt, was now frantically stuffing her expensive silk blouses and designer heels into a literal garbage bag. She was sobbing hysterically, her tears ruining the delicate fabrics as she crammed them inside. She grabbed handfuls of loose clothing, her diamond bracelets clinking harshly against the cheap black plastic. The sound was a poetic reminder of her newly reduced status. Calvin stood completely frozen near the grand staircase, watching his wife reduce their entire luxurious existence to 2 black plastic sacks. He looked completely hollowed out. His chest was heaving with panicked breaths, but he made absolutely no move to help her. His perfectly tailored custom suit suddenly looked entirely ridiculous hanging off his slumping, defeated frame. "Let us go!" the lead deputy barked, gesturing heavily toward the exit. "Move it outside right now." 2 heavily armed deputies flanked my parents, placing firm, commanding hands on their shoulders. They physically escorted Calvin and Yvonne across the polished hardwood floors they had proudly claimed as their own just hours prior. The heavy front doors were pulled wide open, exposing the harsh, glaring midday Georgia sun. I walked slowly behind them, stepping out onto the massive wraparound stone porch, taking in the full scope of their ultimate public disgrace. The scene unfolding on the pristine front lawn was the absolute destruction of the carefully manufactured pastoral illusion my father had spent his entire life protecting. Several of their extremely wealthy neighbors had stepped out of their own sprawling mansions, drawn by the loud sight of the massive moving trucks and the flashing lights of the sheriff cruisers. Women in expensive, pristine tennis outfits were standing at the edge of their manicured driveways, openly pointing and whispering behind their hands. A man walking two purebred dogs stopped dead in his tracks, staring in utter shock as the esteemed local pastor was marched down his own driveway carrying a plastic trash bag. Calvin stumbled at the bottom of the stone steps, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the crushed gravel. He caught his balance and spun around, looking back up at me, where I stood perfectly composed on the elevated porch. The sheer terror in his bloodshot eyes was fully exposed to the bright, unforgiving daylight. The sweat poured heavily down his forehead, soaking into his starched white collar and completely ruining his immaculate presentation. He realized in that exact agonizing moment that there was no secret wealthy benefactor coming to save him. There was no divine intervention coming from the heavens. There was only the daughter he had ruthlessly discarded standing firmly on the property she rightfully owned. "Valerie, please," he begged, his booming voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate wheeze. "You cannot let them do this to us in front of the entire neighborhood. Give me one more week. Just give me 7 days to liquidate some assets and contact the church board. I will pay you back every single cent Trenton lost. I will sign whatever legal contracts you want. Just tell the sheriff to let us back inside. Do not humiliate your own father like this." I looked down at the miserable man who had gladly watched me starve while he bought luxury vehicles for his criminal son. I watched a professional locksmith walk up the porch steps, right past me, carrying a heavy metal drill to permanently change the locks on the custom mahogany doors. "Generational wealth is earned, Dad," I said, my voice projecting clearly and coldly across the quiet manicured lawn. "Not stolen. The locks are being changed." I did not wait to watch the deputies force them off the edge of the driveway. I turned away from my weeping mother and my completely broken father, stepping gracefully down the side stairs toward my parked car. The heavy mechanical thud of the locksmith drilling out the deadbolt echoed loudly behind me, playing a beautiful symphony of absolute closure. I opened my car door and slid into the quiet leather interior, feeling a massive, suffocating weight permanently lift from my chest. The toxic parasitic anchor of my family had finally been completely severed. I pressed the ignition button and the engine roared smoothly to life. Just as I shifted the car into drive, my cell phone vibrated violently in the center console. The caller ID flashed brightly across the digital dashboard screen, displaying the name of Harper's extremely wealthy and notoriously ruthless father. I tapped the screen to accept the call, allowing the audio to connect through the secure Bluetooth speakers. Before I could even offer a polite greeting, a wall of absolute screaming rage exploded through the sound system. Harper's father was entirely unhinged, his voice shaking with a terrifying aggressive fury that made Calvin's earlier anger sound like a pathetic whisper. "I do not care what kind of family loyalty you think you owe that worthless brother of yours," the man roared completely, bypassing any formal introduction. "My daughter is sitting in a filthy police interrogation room, crying her eyes out, because your absolute disaster of a brother convinced her to break into a billionaire's private estate. I have my entire legal team drafting the annulment papers right this exact second. That fake, pathetic marriage is completely over before the ink on the certificate is even dry. And you can tell that arrogant criminal that I am personally suing him for severe emotional distress and massive public defamation. I am going to bury Trenton so deep in civil lawsuits he will never see the light of day again." I listened to the furious billionaire completely incinerate Trenton's entire future. I put my car in gear and slowly drove past my parents, who were now standing on the public sidewalk clutching their garbage bags. I smiled, pressing my foot down firmly on the accelerator, and drove away. 2 weeks passed since the morning I left my parents standing on the public sidewalk, clutching their black plastic garbage bags. The absolute silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever experienced in my entire life. But the devastating consequences of their spectacular collapse were actively rippling through the city and the legal system with ruthless, brutal efficiency. Trenton was no longer the arrogant golden boy who firmly believed the entire world owed him a life of endless luxury. He was currently sitting in a humid concrete holding cell on a small island, completely stripped of his tailored designer suits and his manufactured dignity. The billionaire father of his now former wife had kept every single one of his screaming promises. Harper's aggressive legal team had moved with the speed and precision of a military strike. The marriage annulment was processed almost instantly, citing severe fraudulent misrepresentation and malicious intent. Trenton was left with absolutely zero access to her massive family wealth. Worse, he was facing multiple serious felony charges for the break-in and the property damage. Silas Thorne, the notoriously unforgiving tech mogul, was pressing maximum charges to make a highly public example out of the entitled trespassers who dared to violate his historic estate. My cell phone rang on a quiet, rainy Tuesday afternoon. The caller ID flashed an automated warning indicating an incoming call from a high-security correctional facility. I accepted the charges simply out of a cold, morbid curiosity. Trenton's voice came through the receiver completely broken and saturated with a pathetic, desperate sobbing. "Valerie, please do not hang up," he wept, his voice echoing weakly against the hard walls of his cell. "I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything I have done to you. You have to help me get out of here." Harper's family completely abandoned me, and her father's lawyers froze all my personal bank accounts. I have no legal representation. I have absolutely no money to my name. They are talking about actual hard prison time, Valerie. You are the only one who has the financial resources to get me out of this absolute nightmare. I am your brother. I will do whatever you want. I will work for you and pay you back every single dime. I sat comfortably in my plush leather office chair looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I listened to his pathetic whimpering for exactly 10 seconds. I thought about the entire decade he spent relentlessly mocking my commercial real estate business, calling me a glorified landlord while he squandered our parents' money on fake tech startup companies and luxury imported cars. I remembered the exact arrogant smirk on his face when he stood in my kitchen and told me I was just jealous of his massive success and his beautiful high society bride. He had gleefully watched my parents bleed themselves dry to fund his delusions of grandeur without ever feeling a single ounce of guilt. "Trenton," I said, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy or emotion, "you broke into a billionaire's highly secure historic estate on a live internet broadcast because you felt blindly entitled to my hard-earned property. You humiliated yourself and ruined your own life just for social media clout. Actions have consequences." I pressed the bright red button on my glowing screen, instantly cutting off his hysterical wailing. I blocked the facility's incoming number permanently, ensuring my golden brother could never reach me again. Meanwhile, back in Atlanta, Calvin and Yvonne were experiencing their own personal version of absolute hell. The grand, magnificent illusion they had spent 30 years violently protecting had completely disintegrated overnight. They were now living in a cramped, dark, two-bedroom apartment in a rundown, sprawling complex on the far industrial outskirts of the city. There were no glittering crystal chandeliers and no custom velvet armchairs. Their new grim reality consisted of paper-thin walls, cheap peeling linoleum floors, and the constant rattling noise of heavy highway traffic. The smell of old cooking grease and damp carpet replaced the expensive floral perfumes and imported candles my mother used to buy. The public fallout had been swift and totally merciless. The viral footage of Trenton's humiliating arrest had spread like absolute wildfire across the internet, permanently associating the prestigious family name with criminal trespassing and total fraud. But the ultimate death blow came from the local community they had desperately tried to impress. The prestigious church board, deeply horrified by the incredibly public eviction and the immediate massive scandal surrounding their lead pastor, held an emergency executive meeting. Calvin was formally and permanently excommunicated. He was stripped of his pastoral title, his lucrative church salary, and his pristine, unblemished social standing. The board members actually drove to his cheap new apartment to demand the return of his church keys and his official parking pass. Yvonne fared no better in the aftermath. The elite country club women she had spent decades trying to impress completely turned their backs on her with vicious speed. Her desperate phone calls went straight to voicemail, and her frantic text messages were left entirely unread. She was completely exiled from the high society circles she valued above her own children's mental health and well-being. When she tried to show up at a local charity luncheon, she was politely but firmly turned away at the door by private security. They were entirely isolated, trapped in a cheap, tiny apartment with nothing but the devastating, suffocating reality of their own toxic choices. Later that evening, I was sitting at the massive mahogany desk in my home office, sipping a glass of expensive red wine and reviewing the latest highly profitable acquisition portfolio for Apex Holdings. My laptop chimed with a gentle notification indicating a new incoming email. I glanced at the glowing screen and saw my father's name sitting brightly in the inbox. I opened the message, watching paragraphs of desperate manipulative text fill my screen. It was a sprawling, highly emotional manifesto, completely saturated with their usual toxic buzzwords and religious guilt trips. Calvin wrote extensively about the sacred, unbreakable bonds of family blood. He begged for a second chance, claiming that the universe had humbled them and that they were finally ready to openly acknowledge my immense success. Yvonne had clearly contributed heavily to the message, adding frantic, dramatic sentences about how they were suffering terribly in their tiny, noisy apartment, and how true Black excellence required us to stick together through intense adversity. They promised to change their ways entirely. They promised to respect me as the head of the family. They begged me to use my massive wealth to rescue them and restore the family legacy before it was permanently lost forever. I read their pathetic, desperate pleas with a completely steady, calm heart. There was no lingering guilt and absolutely no hesitation. They did not want a daughter. They simply wanted a new bank to fund their endless delusions. I moved my cursor over the long, emotional text, highlighting the entire message from top to bottom. I took one final sip of my wine, relishing the quiet, peaceful sanctuary I had built entirely on my own. I clicked the delete button, instantly erasing their voices from my life forever. The crystal chandeliers of the Atlanta Biltmore estate cast a warm, golden glowing light across the grand, magnificent ballroom. Waitstaff in crisp white uniform jackets glided effortlessly through the elegant crowd, carrying heavy silver trays of vintage champagne and delicate, expensive hors d'oeuvres. The gentle, sophisticated hum of genuine business conversation blended perfectly with the soft jazz melodies playing from the live brass band situated in the far corner. I stood near the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, looking out at the glittering, beautiful city skyline, wearing a custom-tailored emerald green evening gown that fit me completely perfectly. 2 weeks had passed since the morning I drove away from the Buckhead mansion, leaving my parents standing on the public sidewalk clutching their cheap plastic garbage bags. In those 14 days, I had moved with absolute ruthless efficiency. I completely gutted and renovated the interior of the massive estate, erasing every single trace of Calvin and Yvonne's pretentious, toxic taste. I stripped away their fake gold accents and heavy, dusty velvet curtains, transforming the historic property into a sleek, modern architectural masterpiece. I listed the mansion on the private luxury market and flipped it in record time, securing a massive, unprecedented cash profit for Apex Holdings. The sale sent absolute shockwaves through the elite Atlanta real estate community, firmly cementing my reputation as a formidable, unstoppable financial powerhouse. While my parents were currently suffocating in a cramped, noisy, cheap apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city, completely excommunicated from their church and highly embarrassed in front of their former social circles, I was thriving. While my golden child brother Trenton was sitting broke and terrified in a county holding cell facing severe felony charges and a brutal lawsuit from his former billionaire father-in-law, I was standing in the absolute center of genuine success. Tonight was the annual Apex Charity Gala, an exclusive event I had quietly sponsored for the past 3 years, but was now finally attending as the featured prominent guest of honor. As I walked slowly through the crowded, beautiful ballroom, people naturally parted to let me through, offering genuine, bright smiles and warm, respectful handshakes. These were not the fake, desperate socialites my mother used to constantly chase and beg for approval. These were actual, powerful industry leaders, brilliant private investors, self-made corporate entrepreneurs, and dedicated community builders. They did not care about the disgraced, ruined Pastor Calvin or the imprisoned fraudulent felon Trenton. They only knew Valerie, the brilliant, highly analytical mind behind the most aggressive and successful commercial property acquisitions in the entire Southeast. A prominent regional banking executive stopped me to ask for my professional advice on a complicated downtown commercial zoning project. A leading award-winning architect complimented my recent massive warehouse residential conversion. They respected my sharp intellect, my relentless drive, and my undeniable proven track record. There was absolutely no condescension and absolutely no toxic comparison to a golden child brother. I was completely surrounded by a community of professional peers who valued me exactly for who I was and what I had built entirely on my own merits. The gentle, sharp clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal glass drew my immediate attention toward the front of the room. The master of ceremonies, a highly respected local superior court judge, stepped up to the wooden podium and smiled brightly at the gathered crowd. He spoke eloquently and passionately about the critical importance of visionary corporate leadership and the transformative power of dedicated community investment. Then he loudly called my name, inviting the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings to the main stage. The applause that erupted through the grand, echoing ballroom was absolutely deafening. It was not polite, forced, obligatory clapping. It was a loud, thunderous, roaring ovation of genuine deep respect and profound admiration. I walked up the short flight of carpeted stairs, my emerald green gown sweeping gracefully behind me on the stage floor. I stepped up to the microphone, looking out over the vast sea of smiling, supportive, upturned faces. The bright, warm stage lights felt completely welcoming, a stark, beautiful contrast to the cold, harsh, bitter judgment I had endured my entire childhood. Thank you all for being here tonight, I began, my voice carrying clearly and smoothly across the perfectly silent room. For many years, I operated my business strictly in the quiet shadows. I bought distressed properties, I managed large, complex portfolios, and I built a substantial financial empire very quietly because I was taught from a young age that my independent success would always be viewed as a dangerous threat to the established family order. I was deeply conditioned to believe that a quiet, unassuming daughter was supposed to sacrifice her own ambition to blindly support a traditional family legacy. But recent events have forcefully reminded me that true legacy is not something you inherit or forcefully demand from others. True legacy is something you build with your own two bare hands through relentless, exhausting hard work and absolute, uncompromising moral integrity. I paused, taking a slow, deep, calming breath as the massive crowd watched me with total, undivided, respectful attention. Last week, my firm officially finalized the sale of one of the most prominent historic estates in the Buckhead residential district. The profit margin on that single real estate transaction was monumental, breaking several long-standing regional market records. But achieving massive personal financial wealth was never my ultimate endgame. Wealth is simply a tool. It is a powerful, necessary instrument meant to dismantle the exact systemic barriers that keep brilliant, highly capable people trapped in the dark. That is why I am standing before you tonight. I looked directly into the center of the quiet crowd, my voice ringing with absolute certainty and passionate resolve. I am incredibly proud to officially announce the permanent creation of the Apex Empowerment Foundation, funded by an initial completely private endowment of $2 million directly from my firm. This foundation has one single, highly specific, critical purpose: We are providing immediate substantial capital grants and comprehensive long-term business mentorship to independent Black women entrepreneurs who entirely lack traditional family support. We are actively seeking out the women who have been intentionally overlooked, dismissed, and told they are not enough. We are funding the brilliant daughters who were cast aside, the visionaries who were told to shrink themselves, and the quiet, isolated builders who have been repeatedly told their big dreams are nothing but a disappointment. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute heavy and thick with profound shared emotion. I could see several successful women in the front row wiping quiet, grateful tears from their eyes, completely understanding the deep personal pain and triumph embedded in my words. I was taking the exact agonizing rejection I had suffered from Calvin and Yvonne and actively transforming it into a powerful, unbreakable lifeline for women exactly like me. I was becoming the exact anonymous financial benefactor I had always desperately needed when I was sleeping on the floor of a tiny freezing apartment trying to build my very first business. They always called me the disappointment of the family. They said I didn't know how to build a legacy. They were right about one thing. I didn't build their legacy. I built my own. I failed at being their victim. I reached over to the wooden podium and picked up a delicate crystal flute of vintage champagne. I raised the glass high into the bright, warm stage lights, looking out at the beautiful, deeply supportive crowd as they instantly erupted into a massive, deafening standing ovation. Fade to black. The greatest lesson from this journey is that biological ties never grant anyone the right to destroy your peace or steal your future. Valerie endured years of being the forgotten daughter while her parents worshipped a destructive golden child. By building her own empire and enforcing strict consequences, she proved that true legacy is rooted in hard work and unyielding boundaries rather than blind entitlement. You owe absolutely nothing to people who only value you for what they can extract. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect yourself? Share your story below and subscribe for more.